Hello, and welcome back to Conscious Caregiving with L&L, the show where we're tackling the tough conversations. Today, we've assembled an all-star panel to discuss the issue of end-of-life care. Welcome, everyone, to Conscious Caregiving with L&L. I'm Lance Slatton. I am the co-host of Conscious Caregiving with L&L with my esteemed colleague, Lori LeBay. I'm also the host of All Home Care Matters. I just want to thank you all for being here today with us. And I'd like to first start off by having you introduce yourselves to our viewers and listeners, and I'll start with Dr. Ann Kinney.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I'm Dr. Ann Kinney. I am a geriatrician and a palliative care physician. I have been in the end-of-life arena for quite a long time, but it really came close to home when I helped my mother, who was living with dementia, die from dementia. I did look for some way to help my family at that time and didn't find a lot of resources. So after she left this planet, I blended my clinical experience and my personal experience for a book about making tough decisions about end-of-life care and dementia.
Thank you, Dr. Ann. Mr. David McNally.
Yes, my business career has been as a business consultant. I'm an author and a professional speaker. I have been a caregiver, however. I've had to put that aside for the last 4 years since my wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's back in June of 2019. And she just passed away in June. So I'm now revisiting my future to see what that might look like.
Thank you for being here, David. Pastor Joseph Byrd.
My background is a little odd. I have a background both as a pastor, served one congregation for 18 years, but I also went to law school, and that's what I do now. Actually, I work for the Tennessee Supreme Court, and I had some private practice where I dealt with life care, life estate issues, estate planning, and even Medicare planning. So sort of that pastoral ministry and legal experience came together, and have advanced degrees in theology. So I've been a seminary professor as well. And, you just encounter a lot of people in life, and our own life with my mother-in-law. We found that these issues are end-of-life issues are something that's difficult for some people to make, and finding a way through is very important. And I appreciate this entire panel and what we're doing today.
Thank you. Pastor Ben Murray.
My name is Ben Murray, and I'm the lead pastor at Northville Christian in Northville, Michigan. And I've been in the ministry 18, almost 19 years. And I've served both in Michigan and on Long Island, New York. And I'm just excited to be here today with all of you.
Thank you. Kim Callanan.
Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm the head of Compassion and Choices. We are the largest national nonprofit organization that's devoted exclusively to improving care, expanding options, and empowering everybody to chart their own end-of-life journey. And what we really are about is representing the consumer in trying to help make sure that they can live the final chapter of their lives in a manner that's consistent with their values.
Thank you. Patty Mouton.
Good morning. My name is Patty Mouton. I'm from Orange County, California. I have served as vice president at Alzheimer's Orange County, a local social services not-for-profit, since 2005. Prior to that, I was active in hospice care. I worked on staff in hospice care. I volunteered in hospice care for about 5 years. I was part of the volunteer pastoral care program at Mission Hospital in Mission Viejo, California. And I'm very active in the Diocese of Orange Caring for the Whole Person initiative, and have done quite a bit of speaking statewide on this issue. So I'm very pleased to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Patty. We're pleased to have you. Brian Fulcher.
Yeah, I am Brian Fulcher. I am the family service manager at Sunset Kapalaglotic Funeral Home and Cemetery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my team specifically spends the majority of their time helping people pre-plan their final wishes, pre-plan their legacy. And it's a topic I became passionate about after My grandparents and my grandmother had Alzheimer's. Were able to pre-plan the end of their life and see what a gift that was to our family.
Thank you, Brian. Carrie Rawl.
Hello, I'm Carrie. I am a funeral director with Dignity Memorial Funeral Homes in the greater Twin Cities, Minneapolis area. I'm also a teaching specialist at the University of Minnesota in the program of mortuary science. And for the last 35 years, I have been helping families at the end of life with their planning of funerals, and then also just walking them through that whole process of saying goodbye and having a celebration of life to commemorate their loved one, and just helping people even prior to that when they're in hospice, and just being a good steward and an advocate.
Thank you. Well, as you all know, Lori and I had reached out to you because with Conscious Caregiving with L&L, we wanted to bring our backgrounds into play and talk about tough decisions, tough topics, and conversations that sometimes families aren't thinking about until they're in a state of crisis. Lori, with her background, is the founder of Alzheimer Speaks and the co-founder of Dementia Map. Myself, with All Home Care Matters. We wanted to bring some valuable conversations and resources to the public and to these families. And today's topic is on end-of-life decisions and end-of-life care. So we thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to help with this conversation that I think needs to be had. I'd like to start with Dr. Ann Kinney today and talk about some of these issues that you might see. And we often reserve end-of-life discussions to a time of crisis. Are there any ideas or that anything families could do that could help maybe have these conversations earlier rather than in a state of crisis?
Yes, thanks, Lance. I find that to be true often, that when I'm being a palliative care doctor in the hospital, it's the first time anyone's brought up that someone may be at the end of their life, even though they may have been hospitalized over and over and over again. And so this is a little crazy, but like at cocktail parties or barbecues, I end up talking about end of life a lot to try to normalize it a bit, because it is going to, death and taxes are the things that happen to everyone. And I try all kinds. I've tried with facts, which scares people. I try with humor, which then people think I'm as weird as I probably am. But I think if we can start to have these conversations a little, and what I've noticed is that when people to kind of back into these conversations by using how do you want to live as kind of the jumping off point, so that people can then start thinking, oh, this is how I like my life, be more aspirational. And then they're more likely to talk about maybe what limits might make that something you can live to. I think that if there's any little tricks, things like trying death over dinner, which is a brainchild of a restaurateur and a provocateur, Michael Hebb, who has curated several things on his website, deathoverdinner.org, which can be, I've hosted several death over dinners, and people have told me that it's changed their conversations, and it's had them kind of a ripple effect of going out and talking about it more. This is one of those stigmatized areas of our culture. And so I think sometimes writing things, and maybe writing a note to your family saying, I don't want to be morbid. I want to be a realist, and I would like to talk about these things. Could we maybe take a dinner to talk about and just do a question at a time? My kids and I, my kids and some extended family have been meeting on Zoom once a week since the pandemic, just to stay connected, because we're in different parts of the country. We got used to seeing each other and want to keep doing it. And so sometimes we'll pop in questions, like kind of topics of discussion, and it's expanded our relationship with each other. It's helped us heal in all kinds of ways. So those are some of the things I do in my life to try to move those discussions forward a bit. I mean, my kids roll their eyes at me and they're like, do we have to talk about death again? And I'm like, well, I want you to know what I want if I should become ill, because studies show that if you talk about it and if you tell the people who might need to make decisions for you what you would want, it makes their life so much easier. So it's my job as your parent to inform you. And there is another statistic that my kids are not quite in their 40s yet, but kids in their 40s don't want to talk to their parents about end of life. And it's just, kind of like being toilet trained, which my grandson is doing right now. Some things, whether you want to or not, it's probably a good idea.
I want to follow up on something you said, because I happen to have just shortly been into my 40s, and Pastor Ben will get there soon. But what is the reason for the children not wanting to talk to their parents? Is it the child's fear of having the conversation, or the parents' reluctance to talk to their child in their 40s? Or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's our culture, and that we don't like to talk about death. I think people think that it's going to hurt someone's feelings, or we're humans. We tend to want to do more comfortable things rather than less comfortable things. But as in a lot of life, we find out once we go through some of the more uncomfortable things, we find a freedom at the other end. And I think it's that we haven't had that not speaking of death is fairly common in many, many cultures. But I see, and so if I've also heard, and I don't know which culture it is, that there's a thought that if you talk about death, that might bring it on, which I don't think that's true. I think it might be a fear. So I think it's frequently from fear that you're going to have to talk about uncomfortable things, or that you don't like the answer, or you don't even want to. Most of us don't want to think, oh, I'm going to lose someone who's very near and dear to me. And so if I avoid it, if I don't talk about it, it'll go away. But then what we know on this panel is that it doesn't go away, and it makes the grieving process even harder. So I'm not sure the answer to that question, but I think it's just kind of what we've all lived.
What about for the family or the care partners who are caring for a loved one, and maybe they've lost their ability to voice their preferences or their wishes, or cognitively they're not able to for whatever reason? What do you find is the most difficult aspect for them to make those decisions and have those conversations?
Yeah, I think that is very difficult, and it's very common that to make a decision for yourself is hard enough in many times. But when you have to make a decision for someone else that is considered life and death, and then you have to live by that decision with several other people. An example is when I chose to have my mother go on hospice, because I had to make that decision. Luckily, my mom was great at kind of letting me know what her limits were. I got a lot of pushback she lived in an assisted living, and was relatively independent, but then started to decline during her time. The pushback I got from the healthcare system was like, she's not ready for hospice. But I knew more about cognitive loss and what the normal trajectory, or nothing's normal in cognitive loss, but I knew the potential trajectory and function, and it was the right time, and that she would have a better quality of life. What I find is that care partners are often thinking, if I just had the better care, they wouldn't be getting sicker. So I think part of it is that to be educated, and many of the people here on this panel, Compassion and Choices being one especially good at educating about the normal trajectory. Hopefully the book I wrote as well, all the things that Lori puts on her website. I mean, so many people here are helping with the education piece, but then the psychological or the spiritual, again, I'm a palliative care doctor, so I really believe in this full, like, getting every resource you can. So whether that be a spiritual guide, like one of the pastors on here, or a therapist, if you can journal about it, but you're going to have to deal with those emotions that go with making a decision for someone else, and realize I think when you know, so support groups can also be helpful, but when you know that you're doing the best you can and can kind of live in that groundedness and understand whatever the disease is, it becomes a little easier to make those choices. And then sometimes we have to defend them. Like I had to defend my choice against the ideas of the assisted living staff. And in time, they actually said, you know, we watched you do this with your mom, and she did have a better quality of life. She wasn't back and forth to the hospital. You made sure she was comfortable. At first, we thought you were giving up on her. And so again, those loaded words can be really hard when you're getting advice from other people. But if you can kind of take some of the emotion out of it as best you can as you make the decision, and then live with that, whatever emotion bubbles up, and realize that it'll come and go, but that you've kind of gone with your what you know is true for them. I know in my family, another thing we did is I had a brother who thought my mom wouldn't want to live at all because he wouldn't want to. And I knew that another brother thought she should take every breath she could take for as long as she could. And when you're coming at it with that perspective, in my family, we had 6 kids and everybody had a different opinion about what a good death was or a good end of life for my mom. But once we heard those opinions from everyone, we were able to then kind of say, oh, there's more than one way to do this. There's 6 of us, we have 6 opinions. Now that we know what everyone's opinion is, let's think about what would mom want. And so then you can kind of get into this isn't about me as much as what they would want, and then respecting that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, Dr. Ann. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Lori.
Great. And I'm going to talk with David. I've got some questions for you. David, you just lost your second life partner. So you've been through this process twice. And, how do you have the conversation of end of life options, not only with your partner, but with your family and friends?
It's a great question. And the 2 losses of both wives were diametrically different. So my first wife passed away when she was 57. So that's 20 years ago now. And she died of ovarian cancer. And she did not want to leave. She was, I'm going to use the word angry. She wasn't angry at God or angry at she was just angry that having had 5 children and now was able to live a life and go and do the things, travel that she wanted to do. She was angry at that. Why now does this happen to me? And so what that did, unfortunately, was for the family was that we were not able to have any of those conversations because we felt if to try and have that conversation, we would have been betraying her. So it was a very difficult situation, and it was only about 10 days before she passed away, when she was in hospice, that I said to her, darling, I said, I have to be very frank with you. I said, you may not make it. And think about what I just said. You may not make it. And she's in hospice. That was how careful we were with our language. And at that particular point, she acknowledged, she said, yes, I know. And then what that allowed was those final conversations with our 5 children, that she could have them individually with her, and they could share with her how much they loved her. So that was one of the things that I did not have. Her name was Jo. We married in Australia, where we grew up, and so she was an Australian woman. It's one of those things that I've talked about, quite frankly, and a lot of our friends knew that Jo was going to fight to the very last minute to sustain life. So that was that situation. Now, my situation with Cheryl was so different. So Cheryl and I met at the age of 60. We married at 70. which is we would have been coming up for our 7th wedding anniversary. And the difference with Cheryl was simply that Cheryl always wanted to know, no matter what the health issue may have been, that what was going on with her. And from a physical standpoint, she was a very, very healthy woman. But in 2019, she knew that some things were starting to happen, and her brother had passed away from Alzheimer's, and she got very suspicious that it was in the family. She was unable to go back historically to her mother and father because they were killed in the world's largest airplane crash in 1977 in Tenerife, where the two Pan Am jets collided and 580 people, and they were only at that time 60 and 61. So she had no record from mom and dad whether it was, genetic, but she knew she was suspicious because of her brother. So immediately she started to get the signs, not being able to play the piano, bells in the choir. She said, I want to go to Mayo. And we went to Mayo. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And my wife, Cheryl, I would probably describe as a poster child for someone getting Alzheimer's, because she accepted it, just accepted it right from the beginning, and then said, well, David, let's make the most of whatever time we have left.
Wonderful. Now, in terms of Cheryl's choice, she chose to stop drinking and do the VSED program. How did you receive that as a family? And she pretty much is, I mean, and I had met with you guys too, and from the get-go, she was pretty adamant how she wanted to live her life, which was what Anne was saying. Instead of talking about how you die, how do you want to live your life? How was that received by everyone?
Yeah, a lot of what Anne said was terribly relevant to us, because again, Cheryl, one of Cheryl's daughters is an end-of-life doula. So we had that in the family to begin with, which was very powerful. And again, we had I have 5, Cheryl has 3 children. We had no pushback for what she wanted to do, which was voluntary stop eating and drinking. She read a book by Phyllis Schachter called Choosing to Die. And as soon as she finished reading it, she said to her daughter, Wendy, this is what I want to do. When my time comes, I will do the voluntary stop eating and drinking. And she never wavered from that. And when we looked at it all and we examined what had happened to her brother and how he was in memory care for 5 years, not knowing classic story, not knowing who anybody was, she said, I don't want that for myself, and I don't want it for my family. I don't want to suffer, and I don't want you to suffer. And we got that. We understood that, and we agreed with that. So again, there was no dissension. We were very much aligned. What then happened was that we thought that cognitively she would probably have about 18 months before she had to make the decision. But she hadn't 4 years. She had this incredible ability to continue to communicate, to be sharp, but her executive functioning was the thing that went to hell. She couldn't do anything else but that. But we were very aligned, Laurie, in her choice and decision.
That's wonderful. Did you have any pushback from friends at all? It sounds like family was on board, but I know sometimes friends can push back on, why are you doing this, or I don't understand.
Yeah, I was expecting a lot of pushback especially from my more religious friends, that they would say, pretty classic, no, you don't get to determine when you die. But we had in the end just one pushback in that regard. I was quite amazed and intrigued by the fact that even among my, yes, religious friends, I think they were all at an age and they had such a lot of experience with death already in their own lives and connections to Alzheimer's as well, that they seemed to, of course, they were very uneducated about VSED and knowing what it was. But once they understood it and understood the rationale, and of course, when we made very clear, you have to understand it's a terminal disease. Once they started to put their arms around it, they became much more open. So we didn't have, at least personally to us interactively, we didn't have a lot of pushback.
Okay, wonderful. I do want to mention that in our show notes, we will have some links because Cheryl was featured on the news. You've got some articles and things there too that people will be able to tap into. Lance, I'm going to throw it back to you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Lori. So, Pastor Byrd, full disclosure, you've been a part of several significant milestones and events in my family's life, such as the funeral for my father-in-law and my father, the birth of my children. And my father-in-law specifically was dealing with terminal cancer. And, you know, you were right there every step of the way to the end. In fact, you baptized him as well. As a pastor, what do you see as society changes and the way they change the way they look at end of life and the different options in different states making certain things now legal? How do you advise a family who may be going through a similar situation, who's ready for someone to pass and they don't think they have that quality of life, and maybe the person is expressing it or the family's expressing it for them? How do you advise them given their Christian beliefs and your background as a pastor?
Well, first, let me be clear that I think this is something where individuals are going to find their path, and I have always encouraged folks to, seek in prayer and with family the direction that they want for their lives. I'm going to say something that might put everybody on this panel a little unease, but I think it needs to be said, and that is that sometimes when a person gets to a point of the process, their own desire changes what they want to do. And I've actually had that happen multiple times as a pastor. I've experienced what Dr. Kinney said, where younger people didn't want to talk to their parents about death. And in some cases, I was the lawyer trying to prepare their estate plan. They didn't even want to talk about, who was going to get the family heirloom and who was going to get the couch and all of that. And so then I have, seen families where I remember where an individual had decided he had already had too many heart surgeries. He just was not going to let them, as he would say, crack open his chest again. And he was going to ride this out. And I was there with the family. What we call, Pastor Ben will probably know what I'm talking about, keeping vigil, going over with the family, praying a couple of times like I did with your father-in-law. In that case, I think what happened was, I think that the change came for him in the sense that he really questioned his decision that he made, but he was good with it and he kept it. His wife, on the other hand, was not so good with it. When they first came in my office as a pastor, they were solidly set. He's not going to go in for surgery anymore. This is it. We're going to just, whatever God's going to do. He didn't want to burden the family, and whatever God's going to do, that's what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the things, that's one of the paths people take is, here, whatever God's going to do. She, on the other hand, really began to question and wanted now, some intervention. And she respected his wishes. And then at the end of the process, though, it became a much longer grieving process for her because she thought she knew what she wanted. My own mother is a case of someone who thought they knew what they wanted and changed their mind. She had a do not resuscitate order down. My sister and I were her power attorneys, in fact, for healthcare decisions. And in the middle of the night, when they couldn't reach my sister, they took my mother in. I saw her at the hospital. She had the DNR in place and didn't want to be intubated. And I got a call about 2:00 in the morning after they couldn't reach my mom, and my mom had changed her mind and wanted to be intubated. And so by the time I got to the hospital, I had the unpleasant experience of being sent into the room, into the intensive care unit, where the doctors wanted me to try to settle my mom down because she was resisting the intubation tube. And it was a very difficult hour, to say the least, because they couldn't really anesthetize her to the point where she was at that point, because they were worried about her vitals going down and all of that. It was just a bad situation for about an hour. And finally, we got her settled down. And then as the hours wore on, I was able to say, look, is the only thing keeping her alive the bags that you have her hooked to? And the doctor said, yes, it is. And I said, okay, so here's what we're going to do. I remember what my mom said before, and I know she changed her mind about being intubated, but I'm her healthcare proxy here. And I said, let's take the bags off one at a time, and then we're just going to let God decide what he's going to do, because that's what she had told me originally. And eventually that's what happened. And the doctor eventually said, you did the right thing. She was septic, and that was actually the cause of death. She had gone septic. And as she said, she had cirrhosis of the liver, but not the drinking kind. She always wanted to remind us, So, I think that we find a path, right? I think we find a path, but I think it needs to be said, things change for people. And man, that can make it hard on the people who are serving as the proxy, like it was for me. I mean, it was hard for me in a lot of different, that hour in the intensive care unit was probably the most difficult hour of my life.
It's tough. Thank you for that and for sharing that story. I want to also touch on the church body as a whole. Now, there's different denominations, there's different religions, but I'm just going to use churches in a very general sense here. Are you seeing more churches now breaking away from the formal belief structures that had always existed when it comes to end of life?
Well, I think we're finding that statistically, they tell us anyway, that in the United States, that we're becoming less religious, certainly less Christian. We're in a post-Christian era, much like what Europe is in now. I think that the lack of having some sense of structure in terms of meaning of life and the trajectory of life and where life is going, that is a big loss when you're talking about people in these end of life decisions and moving toward the point of where they are expecting their death at any time. My role as a pastor, and I'll be interested in hearing what Pastor Ben says, my role as a pastor, I always felt like was, in these situations, was leading a person to the threshold of death and letting them go over and saying goodbye, and then turning to the family members that walked with me to that threshold and say, you don't get to go. I need to help you understand that this person's gone over. You don't get to go. The way that I was able to do that, I think, was having that structure of understanding of not just death, but also the meaning of life and how all of this had some sort of meaning, not only for the person who we were helping go over the threshold of death, but also for the family understanding this on the backside, those that we had left behind. So I think that it is a huge loss to us. And let me just say, even in Christian worlds, and it'll also be interesting to hear those on the panel that are from the funeral, I'll call it ministry. You may not call it that, but and I am probably guilty of it. My plan right now is for a cremation for me, but that's just because my family's so far flung that I don't know of a cemetery, that one place that they'll come visit. So, but I get concerned thinking about my years as being a pastor, families who are not having any process of grieving visitation. I get it. A couple of days of visitation at a funeral home, that's exhausting, right? And I would hear families all the time say, I don't want to go through that. Well, what they don't realize is part of that exhaustion is part of that grieving process. And each person goes through it differently, and each person is going to handle it in a different way. And some people may not want to do that. But what I have found is those who try to just go from the person has died and now we're just going to go ahead and have cremation, and we're just not going to have a service, we're just going to move on, it comes back to haunt them. I've had plenty of people in my experience of ministry over the years, and I've officiated about 551 funerals in my lifetime. And in that time, those who never got a chance to either, as Dr. Kinney was talking about, talk about death before, or process the grief of the death of the individual, it comes back in other ways. And it haunts them in a physical way. Sometimes you see the impact of grief in their life, impacting them certainly psychologically. And sometimes it moves them to behaviors that certainly are not healthy. They're coping with that grief in ways that are unhealthy for them. And so I think that the loss of some sense of structure is just an understanding of the meaning of life and what happens after death is a huge loss. And I just leave this with it's a Ricky Gervais movie that's The Invention of Lying, I think is what it's called. And that scene you all might remember where he's trying to tell his mom about the man in the sky and trying to, and it's sort of tongue in cheek, right? About how, it's just, that's the lie that he tells. Well, it's not the first lie, I guess, but it's the lie that he tells about this man in the sky, and that his mom is going to go there and be happy and everything. Well, and I get that, and I understand what Ricky Gervais is saying is someone who I assume is atheist or agnostic at the least. But the question that I always raise is that if you just have that, okay, this is the end, and there's no meaning. I mean, and you have no structure, even if you're not going to pick a Christian structure, but you have no structure about what the meaning of life is in what it means to live a full life and what it means to have a meaningful life. And it's just all gloom. When I take and reverse engineer that scene in that movie, I think what's left then, and you don't have to have necessarily my faith. You don't have to have the structure I have, but I think that dealing with the grief, dealing with the decisions that have to be made without some compass, right, some structure, is just huge. And whether it's just having healthy conversations, as Dr. Kinney was talking about, to the kinds of things that David was sharing, these are important things, I think, not just to help the person who's approaching imminent death, but helping the family members who are going to live with the aftermath of grief at their passing.
Yeah, good answer. I like to talk about anticipatory grief too, because, and I'm sure some of the panelists have experienced and know that well firsthand, it's not always just the grief from the passing, but it's that the anticipation of that person passing and knowing what is to come, that I feel like they need support for that too. And I feel like, oftentimes I know, like with our church, Pastor Byrd, and with my new church with Pastor Ben, there's good support there in place. I think the church plays such a crucial role in being there to support those families, not at the very last minute or the last days, but leading up to those last days, because, a loved one with Alzheimer's, a loved one with cancer, it's not always a quick process where that person's gone in a couple of weeks. It could be months or even years. But that loved one in the family, they're the ones witnessing this and going through all the chemos and all the treatments, or watching the cognitive decline progress. They're already saying goodbye to that person almost every day, and I think having that support there is also crucial. I want to follow up with the last question, Pastor Byrd, about how the churches are impacted by the decisions such as end of life. So what I mean by that is, you used your mother as an example. And, you counseled probably thousands of families, and you go into a home and you're there to, do a prayer visit with somebody or just check in on them, and their loved one is just gone through chemo, just gone through radiation. They're no longer eating, not even by choice, but just because they can't, because it makes them nauseous or sick. And they're saying, why? And I know you will have maybe an answer, but why is God letting this happen to my husband or my child or my wife or to myself? I just want it all to end. And they're in a state where maybe that would be legal and allowed. How is the church now impacted by some of these new laws and choices that are available to families, and how do you counter that with, through the church?
Well, thankfully, I don't have to worry about it. I've retired from pastoral ministry, so that's Pastor Ben's responsibility.
We'll save that one for him then.
So, I will just say, and probably the best, I really think he could seriously probably give us a better answer on that today. In terms of the church as a whole, I think one of the things that I've always looked at, what my role was, and I think this wasn't something new for me, new that I, created or anything, but there's a ministry of presence, right? And you're not there to. One of the prayers that I would often say, one of the things families would often hear me say is, I don't have the answer. If you're looking for me to come up, I remember the days when doctors before HIPAA used to make me go in and tell the family it's time to unplug their loved one. Probably Dr. Kinney may be too young to remember that, but I remember the days when the pastor came in and he was responsible for going in and talking to the family and saying, it's time. At least that's the way I was treated for the most part. That was my role. And sometimes the doctor would corner me and kind of, start putting his finger in my face and saying, why did it happen to a child? I've had to minister to the doctors in some of those scenarios. I think the ministry of presence is not to give, our cliche answers. And I think it's to sit with them in their grief sometimes. It's to sit there and say, I don't know, and in that place, I think that if the church realizes that there is a grace, a ministry of grace that says, we don't have all the answers. I certainly don't have answers that's going to take away what you're feeling right now and what you're experiencing right now. But I'm here. And in the most non-judgmental way, because and I think this is important. And I would say this to so many of my Christian friends who have all their theology correct, right? You go in, it's the person you're seeing here today. They may not be in the same place in 2 or 3 weeks, or, I'm talking about from how they're feeling and what they're thinking and what they're saying. So sometimes trying to correct a person from your theological perspective immediately is not the thing to do, in terms of just keeping the purity of doctrine. Sometimes it's sitting there listening and then having the conversation if you need to at a later time when it's the right time. Just learning the ministry of presence and how important that is, of just being there with people, either if they're in their end of life stage or if they're with their loved one who is in an end of life stage. Just the presence of being there, and then offering the hope and offering the guidance that usually you take your cues from the people, right? If they're angry, I heard David talking about his first wife. The last thing she needed would have been for me to show up and start telling her, exactly how things are and where it is, and all that. That's I think where he was saying about they didn't bring up certain things. I was sitting here in my head saying, yep, know exactly what that means, because when someone is angry, there's just certain things that they're not ready to hear at that point in their grieving process. And so learning to just not feel like you got to fix everything right now, and just having a ministry of presence is one of the most important things that I would say members of churches and churches could practice and become very proficient at would be helpful.
Thank you, Pastor Byrd. I appreciate your time today. Lori?
Well, I'm going to talk with Pastor Benjamin Murray. I think this was a great segue, Pastor Joe, to ask Ben about how are you dealing with all these options? As a church, so much has changed. I'm 64 and I think of, wow, there weren't options when I was a young child and my mom was bringing me to the funerals and wakes, and there was one way to do it, and that was it, and your big choice was, are you being cremated or not? And then that's not that's not the path anymore. So how is the church dealing with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's case by case. When I stepped into the ministry, what feels like so long ago, being green, I thought everything is black and white. It's so simple. It's this way or it's that way. And this is exactly how we should live. And this is exactly what we should do. And then I read a book about 5 years into the ministry, and the pastor talked about how we live in the gray, meaning every situation is different. It doesn't mean truth isn't truth, and lies aren't lies. I'm not implying that. I'm just saying that every situation is different, and you have to handle every situation differently. Generally, by the time they get to me, they're wanting to know what the Bible has to say about situations like this. And so we do have some scripture that we can talk through and we can discuss. They are asking my opinion and my stance on it. They generally know where I'm leaning or what I'm going to say. So a lot of times I'm confirming what they already have in their minds. That's usually the way that it goes. I personally have never had anything combative where someone totally disagrees and then comes in and asks me my opinion on it. It's generally they're looking for comfort. They're looking for someone to tell them, whatever, that this is okay, or this is how you should respond, or this is how you should pray, or, things of that nature. So the question does come up. It doesn't come up a ton for me, but there are times. And during those times, as Pastor Joe pointed out, he just did such an excellent job. I'm going to start attending his church probably after today. I'm thinking the way that he just responded so well. It really is about just being around that person and comforting them and saying it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be mad. It's okay to not understand all these questions. A lot of people just need to hear the words, it's okay. And a lot of times after those meetings, I'm leaving with tears on my shoulders, because they just needed someone to put their arm around them and just, be real and be normal in that moment. So generally it's not the textbook. The Bible answers usually aren't what they're truly looking for. They're usually looking for someone to say, hey, it's okay. I know this is hard. And I can just tell you that God is going to be with you through this. And there's comfort and we're going to be here with you. So that's generally the way the conversations go.
There's a saying in dementia, to walk in their world. And I think, David mentioned that, Joe mentioned that, you've mentioned that now. It really is about validating someone's feelings, not arguing with them, but acknowledging that they exist. We are living in a world in crisis now of loneliness. And, these decisions can be really lonely and really scary and huge impacts. And so, one of the things I'm wondering, with the churches, because I hear, a lot of people go, well, I'm going to go to a grief group. But what I also hear is 8 weeks isn't enough. I need more than that. And so I'm wondering if any of the churches are doing anything. And I can see this with the new birth and end of life in terms of doing groups that talk about how are you going to adapt to the changes in your life? Because even when someone is born, the whole family structure changes, and everybody at every age has to adapt and kind of think through that process. And the same at end of life. And yet everybody's coming kind of from different angles, kind of protecting their own little area in their thought process and all of those types of things. And also trying to protect who's coming in or who's going out as well. So it does get complicated, but is there anything in the church that you see that really brings groups of people together to have these conversations? I just think there's so much support we can give one another, in this time.
Yeah, absolutely, Lori. I think it's funny what you had mentioned from the beginning of life to the end of life. We are all, no matter where you are at in life, we're looking for support. All of us. We're looking for community. We're looking for people to walk alongside us. I mean, when God was creating Adam and Eve, he looked at Adam and said, it's not good for you to be alone, and I think that is important for all of us to remember in every stage of life. I have 2 teenagers right now who are in driver's training, and I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So we're potty training and driver's training. And let me tell you, that is insane. but we hang out with friends like Lance, who you can share these funny stories with, and they laugh with you or cry with you and let you know that you're not crazy. What you're going through and what you're feeling, you are not crazy. And so it is important for churches to provide small community groups. We do have a grief share group. And like you said, it's an 8 to 12 week program and they go through it together. But the relationships that are birthed out of that is incredibly important. And so at the end of our semesters or those classes, when they're done with their grief share group, I'll join that class and I get to hear stories. And I'll tell you what, I cry every single time because they're also touching and moving and every situation is different. But at the end of the class, I don't know if one's gone by yet where I haven't noticed people who started out as strangers are now swapping phone numbers or email addresses, or they have now started friendships, relationships, and ultimately support. And so it is the church's responsibility to provide these avenues. And I can't say that they'll all be specialized. I have many conversations with many people who have a lot of suggestions on what we should be doing as a church. And man, if we had, all the resources and all the people and all the leaders and all, yeah, sure. But just having a community, having a place where you come in on a Sunday morning, on a Wednesday night, throughout the week with what we call life groups, to connect with someone and say, yeah, hey, how are you doing? What do you, whether you're in that stage or not, it's better, to walk through that with someone who's either in the same boat or has been there. But even if that's not the case, and you just have a good friend who's like, you're on my mind, you're on my heart, I've been praying for you, I'm here for you, I want to walk through this difficult season with you. And as Pastor Joe was saying, generally at the end of a funeral, there's always the challenge to the people that are in the room, because they think, a lot of the people in the room at the end of the funeral, their life resumes and they're on to whatever is next. They're going to work, or they're going to this, or going to that. And I always take the opportunity to say, friends and family, this is your opportunity to come around these people, put it, we live in a digital age. Set a reminder in your phone once a week, once every other week, once a month, whatever it may be, to shoot them a text, to give them a call, to set up a coffee date, and just kind of find out how they're doing. So in the church, our goal and our responsibility is to really make that happen and make them feel supported.
Wonderful. I just, I'll throw out an idea for the churches there.
I'll write it down.
And I think we just had our reunion for our Memory Cafe, which we've been doing since 2011, which is for people with dementia and their care partners. And we had some of our original members there who had lost people, but they still felt part of the group. And what they all said was this was so important to do this journey together. So I think with birth and with chronic illness and things like that, with aging, if there were groups that weren't timed, but just went on for however, and people could come and go in a flow, I think would be really, really powerful. I've seen it in action, but I think also for churches who are struggling, many of them with their congregations and getting people together in terms of holding a space, a safe space where they can have friends that understand. And where they're under an umbrella of their beliefs, all of that stuff added together, I think is just really, really powerful. And I am one that firmly believes we have to make comfortable environments for all of these conversations, so that people know their choices and feel supported. So with that, Lance, I'm going to throw it back to you. And again, thank you so much for your comments there.
Kim, welcome. Thank you again for your time today. You're the CEO of Compassion and Choices. I want to start, before I start asking you some questions, just explain what Compassion and Choices is so people are familiar with it.
Sure. Compassion and Choices is the largest national nonprofit organization that's devoted exclusively to realizing patient-directed end-of-life care. So we're really about normalizing end of life so that people are able to live the final chapter of their lives in a way that is consistent with their values and their priorities, and that they can die in a similar manner.
Okay. Thank you, Kim. So let's talk about the steps people or a person should take to plan for dying with dementia.
Sure. And I don't know if it would be appropriate, but I have so much to say. What a great panel to build on some of the other conversations. Would it be appropriate for me to share any of that, or do you want to stick with the original question?
Well, if you wanna elaborate, and then we can go to the question. I do know Pastor Byrd will have to leave here momentarily, and I just want to thank him for his time today. And but yeah, please, if you want to expand on anything you heard, or.
I mean, first of all, what an incredibly powerful group of panels. So thank you so much for putting this together. I really loved what Dr. Kinney was talking about when she was talking about normalizing death and the way she approaches it at a party and sort of bringing it out of the shadows. And I just wanted to add to that we have a gift right now, and that finally the issue of how one dies is making its way into popular culture. And for me, the pinnacle of that is kind of the Barbie movie. Like, the entire Barbie movie all is about her contemplating the inevitability of death. And when you think about popular culture, the idea that stereotypical Barbie is a movie about her actually deals with death is pretty phenomenal in our society. And so I just wanted to throw the idea out. One of the things that I have found is really helpful is using popular culture as a way to broach conversations with people. And it's an easy way to have that conversation where it doesn't feel so uncomfortable because it's out there in popular culture. And you can't get away from it now. It's in TV scripts, it's in whole movies written about it. And, now we have, I think, the gift of the Barbie movie and really bringing it forward. And then in terms of what the two pastors said, both of which I thought were really brilliant, I just wanted to acknowledge the diversity of faiths that we have in this country. And so we're talking about the church, but the church, I don't know if that's a reference just to the Catholic Church or a reference to I heard a lot of Christianity, but we have a Faith Leaders for Choice program, which is hundreds of faith leaders who all are very committed to advancing end-of-life choice and bringing that to their congregants. And they as faith leaders are often the one that's bedside, and they see it as their responsibility to really help move people along, and are very comfortable embracing the inevitability of death and see that as being consistent with both their pastoral duties as well as the faith that they're operating in. And if you look at someone like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he actually actively advocated for passage of medical aid in dying. So I just wanted to acknowledge the diversity of faith that we have within this country. And also invite faith leaders who are interested in this to come and join our Faith Leaders for Choice entity. So great conversation, and really, really smart people you've pulled together. So thank you.
My grandma said, "You are the company you keep." So thank you.
For sure, yeah.
So I want to go back real quick to go back to the question, though. When a person has a loved one and they are dealing with dementia, what steps should a person take to plan for dying with dementia? What does that look like?
Yeah. And so first, I also want to acknowledge David, because he's absolutely right that his wife was incredible. And she ended up partnering with us to share her story. So we do have a lot of her resources on our website. And I would say do everything she did because she was phenomenal. But basically, the simplest thing for someone to do is we have a tool on our website called the Dementia Values and Priorities tool. And it identifies common markers that somebody has when they have dementia. So, or across the span of dementia, I can no longer recognize my loved ones. I can't feed myself, clothe myself, dress myself. I can no longer pray in a manner that I want is consistent with who I've been my whole life. And those markers are things that happen along the journey of dementia. And as David acknowledged, You can live for many, many, many years after a dementia diagnosis and have super meaningful life. And I think oftentimes people think, oh my God, I have dementia, like tomorrow everything is going to be different. And that's not really how it works. But for most people, what the survey data shows is there comes a point at which they would no longer want their life artificially extended if they were to get dementia. But the reality is that within our medical system, that is what happened. So when my grandmother got dementia, we continued to treat her pneumonia. So we were actually interceding from what God's will would have been. Medicine is the intervention rather than allowing the natural course to take hold. And nowadays we can allow the natural course to take hold with medicine, like Anne was talking about, so that it's palliative and comfortable and someone's not suffering, but we don't have to be prolonging their life artificially if that's not what they would want. And I do want to acknowledge, I can't remember who said it, but someone talked about the fact that people often change their minds, and that's absolutely true. And that's why it's so important that if a person is still mentally capable, that you're following what they want in that moment, not what they put down on a piece of paper. So we have this really powerful tool. You can document the level of care that you want. So if you want all available treatment and you want someone to act in that way, you're documenting that. If you don't want to continue to get life-prolonging treatments like an antibiotic, you can document that. If you want life-prolonging treatments, like you want to stay on your diabetes medication and you want your antibiotic, but you don't want the real extreme things that happen if you go to the hospital, you can document that. And it produces a customized advance directive for you, which really serves as the roadmap for your caregiver to be able to provide the exact level of care that you want, nothing more and nothing less. And the conversation that we had earlier, where Pastor talked about the fact that if you don't, at the end of life, it becomes really difficult, like to deal with grief. The thing that I have found is the biggest differentiator between how someone handles grief is whether they've had closure in their life with that person. So what this care plan does is it allows you to have real closure about what that person would want, so that when you're carrying out their wishes, it's not done with guilt, it's not done with uncertainty, it's done with clarity. And having those conversations with someone gives them the clarity. So it's not that you won't grieve and it's not that you won't suffer, but it's a different kind of grieving and a different kind of suffering, because you have with it closure and you have with it the peace of mind that you have done exactly what that person would have wanted.
Absolutely. So, as you're aware of, planning for death is very difficult for any of us, regardless of the relationships, and some become more complicated than others. Is there a reason people should not just leave the decision making to their loved ones if they're able to make those decisions? Who will be able to make decisions based on what is happening in the moment?
Yeah. So I think it's really, really important to have conversations with your loved ones and not just leave it to them. And I watch this time and time again, and it is just so heartbreaking. But to be the family person there, we always talk about life and death decisions. Oh, that's not a life and death decision. Well, this is a life and death decision you're talking about. And people think the decision is just, am I going to live or am I going to die? But that's not actually the decision you're making. Some of the treatments that you're talking about cause more suffering, prolong people living in a manner that they wouldn't want to live. So it's not like, oh, if I treat them, I'm a good person, and if I don't treat them, I'm a bad person. Some of the treatment that, or the choices that you're making is going to result in somebody living in a manner that they really would not want. And then, of course, not treating them could result in death, which is a lot of emotions for somebody to be responsible for that. But what's most important is people think you fill out a simple advance directive, and that's all the conversations you need to have. Oh, I've filled out this advance directive and I know whether to do a DNR, I'm done. But it's not that simple. Like there's like 2 or 3 things on, the state forms that are giving you, but the number of decisions that you're making when it comes to the end of life are far more complicated than that. So it's much more important that you understand, what does quality of life look to this person? Is it most important that they're there able to, hold their grandbaby for one last time? Or is it most important that they're there for two more years, but they might be lying in bed, unable to have any kind of quality of life? Those are important things to understand, because then you can have a conversation with the healthcare team and your providers about, what's the likelihood that X is going to happen if I choose this treatment? If you've just simply filled out an advance directive, and you know whether or not they want to be intubated, that gives you like a tiny slice at what you're going to be up against. And what I see is people filled with guilt and anguish when they haven't had conversations, and a lot more clarity in the face of difficulty when they do have conversations.
Well, and I'll agree with you 100%, Kim. And I've told this story before, when I was in college, one of my courses was a hospice course, and we were made by the professor to fill out the 5 Wishes book. Yep. And, you're 21, 20 years old, and you're thinking, why would I ever need to fill this thing out? Well, maturity and age teaches you things, right? And experience. And now I tell people, it's never too early to express what your wishes are, or what you want to have happen, or at least where you're at in your life now and what you think you would like. Because, we help countless families here in our state of Michigan, and, 15-year-old boy, in a car accident, now he's paralyzed, and, all these different scenarios. And they never had those conversations. So now the families, they're making the choices based on what they think is in the best interest of their loved one. And yet they can't ever say for sure, though, that that's what their loved one would want, because they didn't take that few minutes to either have the conversation or, fill out these, documents just so people know what they would like to have happen. Another thing we encounter all the time, too, though, is people asking us, are more and more people getting dementia now? Are more and more people passing from dementia? We have the baby boomers, so our population's a lot larger now, all these different factors. But are more people passing with or from dementia now than they have been?
Yeah, so the data does show that more people are dying with or from dementia. And it's really because medicine has gotten so good. Like, people used to die of heart attacks. They used to die of disease. They used to die of dehydration. And as medicine has gotten better, we're better and better at being able to treat everything except for knowing how to keep the mind alive. And so that's why you see, when you look at the studies, more and more people dying with or from dementia than you previously had. But what it also tells us is it's a man-created problem, but it's man's success at medicine is exacerbating the problem. So we actually can reverse the length of time that someone lives with dementia, if that's not what they want, simply by not continuing to intervene with medicine to extend their life, instead use medicine to control the suffering that someone's experiencing.
Right. And, it seems a vast majority of people say they would not want to live with dementia, especially in a state of advanced dementia. Are there legal options to avoid that?
Yeah. So, there's two kind of options that people have that allow them to take charge if they have dementia. The first is the option that David's wife chose, which is to voluntarily stop eating and drinking. And you have to do that very early on when you're still mentally capable. You want to do it with the support of your healthcare team and your family. A very few people choose the option because it does take a certain level of kind of wherewithal and strength, but there are people who choose that as an option, and it is legal and allowable. The second option, which is the option that I wish more people were to recognize, is to I wish people would recognize both of them. I didn't mean to suggest one was better than the other, but people don't think about the fact that we are artificially extending life each and every day. And if you just fill out the customized advance directive on our website that I talked about, you have the potential to disrupt the mode of extending life if that's not what you would want. And it has the potential to really transform the end of life for people. And very, very few people are aware of it or take advantage of it. And you could save yourself 2, 3, 4 years of living in a nursing home with advanced dementia if that's not what you want. And what the data shows us is the vast majority of people would not want it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate you being here. Lori?
I just say one more thing. I'm sorry before you go. I just want to really reinforce that people can live for many, many years, as David White did, with very meaningful quality of life with dementia. So I don't want people to walk away thinking that a diagnosis of dementia means that there's nothing left for you, because that's often not the case. It's really the very, very end when a person no longer, that for most people is what they're trying to avoid. So I just wanted to really underscore that.
I agree. And just to plug Lori and I's last panel we had last month, Seniors in Driving, which was tremendous. We had Michael on, and he was diagnosed with dementia, I think 14 years ago. Lori, is that correct? Yeah. And the doctor at the time told him, you have dementia, you need to stop driving. Well, they didn't take the doctor's word for it, and he is still driving to this day. In fact, he was telling us how he just took a Lamborghini on, I think, 140-mile-an-hour racetrack. And he's just enjoying life and has a high quality of life and still living a productive life, So yes, you're 100% right.
Yeah. And to reinforce that, my mom lived 30 years with the disease. So, and it was really her last 3 years where she struggled to communicate. But even after having these conversations, I'm a girl that likes all my choices, but I always say, people would ask me, like at the end, we did a panel of this years ago, and they're like, well, Lori, what are you thinking? And I'm like, I wouldn't have given up a moment of my mom through the whole journey. For myself, I might look at that differently. I might change my mind, like Pastor Joe said too, and Pastor Ben. So, I mean, it's one of those things that's difficult. I do want to mention, before I go to Patty, though, that your dementia tool is, in my opinion, Kim, is way more than a dementia tool. People with strokes and all kinds of things, it really helps people decide if I have this and this and this. You can mix them up and you can change the level of care. It really is a wonderful guide, I think, for anybody to look at how they want to be cared for. And it gives a wide spread of how that is done as well. And so I appreciate the tools and things that you have there. So Patty, let's get to you. You are in the thick of Alzheimer's, working at Alzheimer's Orange County. One of the things, I wanted to ask you was, since assisted suicide has come into place in terms of care, how are you seeing that in terms of senior care as a whole? And of course, people with dementia as well.
Well, in most states where physician-assisted suicide is legal, it is not so, and it is not an option for people with a diagnosis of a cognitive disorder like a dementia, Alzheimer's type dementia, or whatever the variety of dementia it is. And I want to respond to something that Mrs. Cullinan said with respect to the dementia values and priorities tool. It's a good tool for initiating deep conversations, but it is not legally actionable. Advance directives have really one purpose legally, and that is to name the person that would make decisions for someone if they could no longer make decisions for themselves. Everything else that's put into an advanced healthcare directive is a suggestion for care in the future, but it is not legally actionable. The only way for people to have legally actionable directions is if they fill out what in California is known as the POST document, Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. In some cases, it's called a POST document or a MOST document, depending upon the state, and more than 30 states have a similar medical legal order that is done, again, in addition to an advanced healthcare directive. And it states very specifically what medical interventions the person would decide was okay for them and under what circumstances. And in order for it to be actionable, it must be reviewed and signed by a licensed clinical provider, physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant. So there's a big difference between writing down your thoughts for suggestions for care in the future and completing a medical legal order that then documents and now becomes actionable that healthcare professionals are required to follow. So big difference, especially with respect to cardiopulmonary resuscitation. If people do not want CPR and they're in a state of advanced illness, in California, just about the only way to ensure they don't get CPR in the event of a cardiac arrest is to have an executed pulse document. So it's an important distinction for people. Just writing it down, just telling your family does not ensure that these are at all legally actionable orders. It's just a suggestion for care. So what am I seeing in terms of people asking about physician-assisted suicide? We aren't hearing a lot of that. Where we hear about the desire for suicide is oftentimes with men who have received a recent diagnosis, usually in early stage dementia. And that's when they become very, very depressed and start to contemplate suicide. So a lot of supports need to be in place to ensure people understand that a diagnosis of dementia is not the end of life, that it's going to present some very, very significant speed bumps in life, and it's a terminal disease. It's going to be difficult, but it's not the end of someone's life. And as you said, Lori, sometimes people live many years of very productive lives, albeit with some limitations, but they still enjoy their lives. And their quality of life would be considered really very high. And so I think that there's a real stigma that we have a responsibility to disabuse people of the notion that a dementia diagnosis is the end of all that could be enjoyed or all that could be quality of life. When we have had people ask about assisted suicide, our protocol is to refer them to a mental health professional so that they can really talk about what's going on. The majority of people, according to the Institute of Medicine's report in 2014 and many studies subsequent to that report, are that people don't fear death so much as they fear suffering and pain. So our job as professionals, no matter what our discipline happens to be, clergy, social services, clinical professionals, we have a moral imperative to ensure that people with serious or terminal illness diagnoses understand that suffering can be addressed, and that if they have really excellent palliative and hospice care, then suffering and a plan of care to address suffering as it changes and needs different kinds of interventions can be addressed. And that if you have a really good palliative and hospice care team, they're going to be also addressing the suffering inherent in what the family is going through. So that's part of what the Conference of Catholic Bishops in California decided that they wanted to address with the Caring for the Whole Person initiative. It's not so much, don't ever think about assisted suicide. It's not the sky is falling. It's the genesis is, why would people want to end their lives prematurely? What causes that? And so in that context, we look to identify, ferret out suffering that maybe hasn't even been articulated. Maybe it's emotional, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's fear or loneliness related, and look at the whole person and then holistically look to address their suffering. So we have had people talk about assisted suicide because they were seriously ill, and perhaps they were also in grief from the loss of someone near and dear to them in the recent history. And they're talking about wanting assisted suicide, when really, when you start to peel back the onion, what they really want to be sure of is that they're not going to be alone. And, oh, the hinges on the front door need to be fixed. And it was an overwhelming problem. And I don't have to make up or embellish any of my stories about the families with whom I've interacted. These are all true stories. A woman was talking about assisted suicide when really all she wanted was her front door fixed and somebody who would be with her in her journey as she got more ill. So sometimes we don't look for the Occam's razor. The simplest answer might be the solution to the problem that's presenting itself. So rather than go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I agree that a lot of people worry about the suffering and pain, but I think there's also another level of quality of life and not wanting to be a burden that comes into play for many, many people as well. And I think we have to look at the whole picture. And, with the woman who, needed her door fixed, it kind of gets back to that loneliness factor of feeling isolated in the world. And how do we make that more comfortable as well?
Right. And I think, well, let me just say that I think that there is a real misunderstanding, particularly of the teachings of the Catholic Church with respect to end-of-life care. And I just want to say, church can be defined many, many different ways. And it was brought up earlier, what are we talking about when we say the church? The church is all of us. It's the community of believers that are united in some way in certain threads of belief. So we're all united in that context. And the Catholic Church's rubrics on end-of-life care have actually been mirrored in every Christian denomination. They're almost exactly the same. And what the misnomer is that the church does not have any requirements to artificially extend life. If treatments are considered to be burdensome spiritually, financially, physically, emotionally, then provisions are absolutely all right to allow natural death. So people are not required to be on ventilators. They are not required to have CPR. They are not required to have artificial hydration or artificial nutrition. And in fact, the church recognizes that all of the current literature supports that in dementia, in end-stage care, artificial nutrition and hydration actually create more clinical problems than they seek to solve. So people are not required to adopt those kinds of interventions if it's not what they want, or if they consider it to be burdensome for any number of good reasons. So there is a compassion, and there is a really intellectually well-founded approach to end-of-life care that the church has published in the ethical and religious directives on end-of-life care that people are misinformed about.
Okay. Well, thank you, Patty. Lance, I'm going to throw it back to you because I know we want to get Brian and Carrie in here, and I'm sure we've got others that are going to have some comments as well.
Yes. Thank you, Lori. Brian, thank you again for your time today. You've heard a lot of discussion about the illnesses, diseases, the journey towards end of life. Families oftentimes, just like the conversations that Dr. Ann had mentioned earlier, they tend to like to avoid them for whatever reason of their situation calls for. They might also want to avoid talking about the funeral. So therefore, they're not probably coming into you talking about the pre-planning, because they're not even talking about the end-of-life care that they would like to have for their loved ones or for themselves. What are the benefits, though, of a family coming in and discussing and starting the pre-planning process for the funeral?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a ton of benefits, but there's two main ones that I like to highlight. And the first one is a simple economic benefit, a financial benefit. Inflation's a real thing. Inflation is a real thing in the funeral and cemetery business. And when a family takes the time to not only pre-plan, but pre-fund their arrangements in cemetery, that price is locked in. That price is, it doesn't matter if the time of need hasn't happened for 20 or 30 years. And we see those instances and we laugh at those prices when people locked in the late 80s or early 90s. So there's a huge financial benefit to it. But I think the bigger one, which a lot of people have talked about here, is that your spouse or your children, they don't have to guess at what it is you wanted. Do you want a traditional casketed burial? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be scattered? Do you want to be in a mausoleum in the ground? There's so many choices in funeral and in cemetery, and removing any doubt about what it is you wanted, I think, is just such a key benefit to pre-planning.
Okay, thank you. Walk us through the process. What's involved when a family comes and meets with you and they want to start discussing pre-planning for the funeral?
Yeah, sure. It's we try to break it down to kind of 4 simple steps to pre-planning, and the first one is a lot of, again, what we've talked about here and what I just mentioned. But that's just reflecting. What type of service do you want? What type of legacy? I think it was Pastor Joe mentioned he doesn't have a cemetery where he feels like a lot of people would, be central for his family, but I'm a big believer that there should be a place that someone can come and remember. So it's reflecting about those decisions and thinking through all those. And then the second step to it is really just recording them, writing them down somewhere where your loved ones can access it. Most funeral homes have sort of a pre-planning guide that they can provide you with, or just make a file and make sure that your loved ones know where that file is that lists what you want. The third step to it is, as I just mentioned, the financial implications is securing it somehow, or they're paying for it in full, or taking out some sort of insurance contract to cover that so that those expenses are taken care of. And then most importantly, and Dr. Kinney talked about this, share it with the people who are going to be making those decisions for you. Because if they don't know where to find this document and these plans you've made, then they're not worth anything. So that's equally as important, is to make sure you share that plan with people.
Absolutely. So we never know what somebody might see or hear today that triggers, reaching out to one of your resources or taking actions in their lives with the situations they're dealing with. They might decide, what, we do need to start pre-planning for mom's funeral, or, whoever the loved one may be. How would they begin that process? What would they need to do? Yeah.
Well, if you're in Minneapolis, you should contact my team. But if you're anywhere else in the United States listening to this, contact the funeral home that your family has worked with or is nearby. And I promise you there's someone there who'd be happy to sit down and start having these conversations with you.
What does that conversation look like? Is there things they need to take with them?
Yeah. The conversation is going to start with, like we said, kind of the reflecting part of it, and just starting, do you want to, have you thought about cremation? Have you thought about a traditional funeral service? Do you want that to be in a church? Do you want it to be at a country club or a community center? What do you want that celebration of life to look like? One of my favorite stories is from someone on my team said that someone came in and said they just wanted a simple service, but they wanted an Elvis impersonator there. Well, that's doable, but it's not simple necessarily. So the word simple can mean so many different things to so many different people. So I think the first part of that process really is thinking about what you want your legacy to look like, how you want your life celebrated.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing that. Lori?
I'll just make a comment on the pre-planning, because I did that with my folks, and it was so helpful for me to be there with them, to go through that conversation, to hear it in their own words, and for us to be able to have a conversation during that too. There's so many details that you don't think about, or being able to have a prepaid plan that's in place really lessened the burden for family. Then afterwards, there's still stuff you have to do. It's not all done. You're still probably going to have to write the obit and do things like that. But boy, it really lessens the burden. If they want to have a luncheon, and do they want to pay for flowers, and all of those types of things. There's just so much in there. But again, their wishes, on how they want that gathering to be and what the focus is. to me was extremely, extremely helpful. So I would highly recommend that to anybody to go through that mode themselves. Carrie, I want to pull you into this conversation because as a funeral director, Lance had mentioned the anticipatory grief, of families in addressing that. How do you deal with that as a funeral director?
Well, that's a good question. And it depends all upon the families that are sitting across the table with me. There's a lot of commonality that they all share. And that is, they have this unbelievable relief that, mom or dad is no longer in pain. I guess pain is a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but they have this, they feel like, well, for one thing, they have the survivor guilt of that they've been, whatever the diagnosis came, if it was a year ago or 5 years ago, they lost that person that they knew was their mom or their dad or their loved one. And now they've had all this time to grieve that. And then now they're actually gone. The shell is gone. And how do we get back to celebrating that life before the disease or the illness took over and took the essence of that person away? And so we do a lot of, as Brian had said, a lot of reflecting, a lot of storytelling. One of the biggest things, though, I find with families with their anticipatory grief is that they need to feel validated. So we get to talking about the deceased sooner or later, but I spend a lot of my first 10, 15, 20 minutes of making funeral arrangements just talking to the people that I'm looking at of how they are and where they're at, and to validate how they feel. And a family of 6 people, each one of them can have various different emotions come out. They really appreciate the fact that someone is listening to them, because a lot of times they keep that, pardon the cliche, the stiff upper lip, and they just appear to be strong, and then all of a sudden they are awash in emotion.
So, there's been so many changes in terms of death and funerals and wakes and celebrations of life. I was talking with somebody the other day who was working with a startup company that wanted to be the kind of wedding planner for death and dying and really customizing things. Are you seeing more of that? I know, like when my mom passed away, I ended up working with a friend of mine who's a hospice worker, and I would call her an end-of-life doula if she's certified or not. But we really customized her service. And what was fun was everybody who walked out, because many people didn't know my mom, they came for the family, said, we really know who your mom was. We really got to tell the story, and we played music at the end, and it was uplifting, and people were smiling instead of crying, on their way out. I guess I'm kind of seeing that shift in terms of, I don't know what I'm going to walk into when I go to a funeral. People are having, personal things scattered all over the room now. And the presentations have changed from not just pictures to video. And some of them are not just the photos, but they're talking. And what are you seeing?
Well, I think there's been a big shift probably in the last 10 to 15 years that the baby boomers, who are credited for a lot, are actually given credit to, and pardon the pun, thinking out of the box, that they don't want their services to be like their parents or their grandparents. So the day of the traditional 2 to 3 day funeral is almost gone. Very rarely do we see that someone comes in and they want to have that extended type of services. Nowadays, most families want, because of just the way life is, they would like it all done in one day. And they want to be able to really just kind of celebrate who that person was. And I've always said to families, there is no in funeral service. Basically, it's going to boil down to cost. So what would you like to do? We had a family that had their mother she unfortunately had a brain aneurysm at Christmas and died within a couple of days. And they had her cremated, but they knew that they wanted to have a celebration for her in May. And they knew exactly they wanted it in our historical mausoleums chapel. They wanted a funeral celebrant, and they wanted a huge circus tent outside where they could have lunch afterwards and play music and have the kids roll around in the grass. And we did that. They had exactly what they wanted. And I think I myself am a funeral celebrant, so I do write funerals. I tell families I'm not religious. I'm very spiritual, but I am not religious, but I'm a great storyteller. And so funeral celebrants have done a really good job of taking the families that may not have a church home and play a role in making that funeral service for their loved one very special and very personalized. And yes, sometimes families get carried away, but you only do a funeral once. So I think that it's just important to basically listen to them and to help them plan something that is going to be very meaningful to them, not necessarily for anybody else, but to them.
Now, you mentioned this funeral celebrant. Is that like an association or?
Well, I'm trained through Insights, which is out of Oklahoma. It is an institute that you go to school and you learn how various piecing together a funeral service, from taking the story of a person and putting it into a 25 to 35 minute service that allows for people to speak if they want to open it up for reminiscing, or to just basically, I've had some services where they've just wanted to play one song after another. It just is, it's one of those, I think it's been around for about maybe 15, 20 years now. And it's just offering another aspect for people who, again, don't maybe never have had any kind of religious denomination, or who no longer find that is valuable. But they have someone who's going to so-called be the master of ceremony.
Now, another thing that I ran across, in fact, I had a friend who planned this, who had cancer, and she wanted to be part of her celebration of life. And so they had hosted that at a country club, but she died just a couple days prior and didn't make it. Are you seeing more of that, where people want to be involved and be able to actually say goodbye to their friends and family?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I also teach at the University of Minnesota, and one of the things that we're going to talk about in my funeral arrangement class is the use of AI in funerals, which is becoming more and more popular, where people will actually be videotaped. They'll have scripted questions that they answer, and then in their funeral service, they will be part of that service in the AI form. And it hasn't really caught on here in Minnesota. We're pretty much, we're the last people that get all these technologies, just I think because we're logistically in the middle of the country. But that is, as I've heard from my colleagues on both coasts, that is becoming something that families really enjoy. Having the photo show go in the service with actually the deceased narrating what the pictures were or how they felt about it. So there's so many different ways that I think that is going to become more and more popular and incorporated.
Wonderful. I know for myself, I wrote a letter that I wanted read, and my daughter's like, what? And I'm like, hey, I was like the last word, and I want to lift people up, and I want to thank them for being in my life. And she just kind of shakes her head. Same with, I want to be cremated, and she doesn't like that idea. And I just, I said, honey, let me be small once in my life, just let me be small. And, we use humor a lot, in terms of trying to deal with this, because they're big topics. Well, this has just been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate everybody's input. At this point, we want to kind of open it up because I'm sure people have some comments that they want to add in. I know, Kim, you had a comment that you wanted to make, so I'll let you go first. But if people want to raise their hands, and we can kind of structure that easily.
Thank you so much, Lori. And wow, thanks for such a great panel of people. It's really phenomenal. So I just wanted to be sure that your listeners, to lift up something that Patty said earlier, to be sure that your listeners understood exactly what the option, it was referred to as assisted suicide. And I do just want to note that I think it does a disservice both to people who are suicidal and to people who choose the option of medical aid in dying to refer to it as assisted suicide. It's really different when a person is terminally ill, they're going to die, and they choose the option of medical aid in dying to refer to it as suicide. And we know for the few people that do choose that option, that they really do find it offensive for it to be referred to as suicide. It's also legally not accurate. The laws themselves specifically distinguish the option of medical aid in dying from suicide. So I wanted to just make that note to be sure that your readers were aware that the official terminology for that option is medical aid in dying. In addition to that, I think it's really important to understand that it is not in any state allowed for people who have Alzheimer's. It is, you have to be mentally competent. And that is because of exactly what, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Joe who talked about earlier, the fact that people often change their mind, and we want to be sure we're protecting vulnerable populations. And so the option is available if you're mentally capable, terminally ill, have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, and are able to take the medication yourself. And that's the protection that's there to ensure that vulnerable populations are protected. And then the third thing that I just wanted to call out about it is very few people choose the option, but one of the things that's so important about it is for the small number of people that do choose the option, they come forward, and exactly what Patty said does happen. People say, I want this option, and it turns out that's not really what they want. They want something else. But what having the option of medical aid in dying does is it brings a conversation out in the open. So rather than that person having those thoughts and having no place to go with it, it brings the conversation out in the open to their doctor, and together with their doctor, they can decide what it is, what kind of care that they want. And then finally, there are a small group of people where it doesn't matter how much medication is provided or what the best palliative care is that is out there, it is not going to satisfy the suffering that they're experiencing. And it's that small number of people who choose the option of medical aid in dying, and we know it's fewer than 1% of people in all of the states. But the option itself brings tremendous peace of mind to people. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of those things for people. Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to jump in really quick just because I had a member of my dementia chats group who actually chose that. They actually moved to Oregon to be able to do that. And what happened in that situation, and we had a conversation about this whole piece, and there were people on all sides, for it, against it, the whole 9 yards. But in the end, everyone agreed it was the best thing for this woman. And she announced it to everybody 3 months ahead of time. And on social media, she was showing all her friends and family that came to say goodbye. And it really highlighted a different edge of what it was all about. And she felt so at peace with her decision, and so did her family. Again, I'm not saying it's for everyone, but it really opened the door to it wasn't a rash decision. It was something that she really felt would be better for her family because she couldn't meet their needs. And, again, had dementia. Won't go into all the details, but it was very interesting. So I think this conversation today about all the choices we have is just absolutely critical. So you can put your hands back up again, and Lance will pull people in.
Ann, Dr. Ann, I want to go to you. You had a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry,
I do have a lawnmower in the back, so sorry about that. I just wanted to, well, one, I wanted to confirm what Kimberly said, that when people come and speak with me, it is that they just want that they have a choice, that they're feeling overwhelmed by so many things, and to feel like the choice has been taken away from them, or to realize that a choice is offered them. Very few would ever want to actually implement it. They just want to know that if things got as bad as their imagination makes it, they would have a way. And that brings me to the point where the pastor was saying that his mother changed her mind. If we're that, if somebody who has done a very thoughtful review of their values and their choices and documented them well, and that's unfortunately not a majority of people, but if you've had that and you start to change your mind, that I think also needs to be looked at. And I really appreciate that he thought, no, her bigger issue is she wouldn't want to be on this machine. A point, we all can get into a point of fear or extreme pain or extreme shortness of breath, which is frightening, and you may change your mind in the moment. And to me, that says that potentially the medical system failed her in that they didn't get her into a comfortable place. Our medical system is fraught with problems, and the training of physicians and the culture is not as broad as this panel. And so if your intuition tells you that things are not quite right, expand out to a specialist in palliative care, the opinions and all the resources that are going to come from this amazing panel, because there are other choices than I think we've almost over medicalized death, and it doesn't need to be so medicalized. And I think I just wanted to say that I came here with questions about having discussions, and that is broader than, is there a pill for that, or is there a medicine for that? It's about these deeper conversations.
Absolutely. And we appreciate that you are here adding to that conversation, because I think it just shows there's a role for all of your backgrounds and expertise, if you will, to play in this part of healthcare society as a whole. I just want to follow up real quick, and then I know Lori's going to go to David. Have you seen an increase or at all patients or families asking about this option?
I probably, yes. People living with dementia, I agree with what everyone was saying. I think we're moving to a point where dementia is a chronic disease with a terminal end, and that the terminal end, people are clear, they want that to be shorter. They definitely want their quality of life to be excellent as long as possible, just like people with cancer. I think we're going to get to the point where dementia is not as stigmatized. As Lori was saying, we need to stop the stigma and get it out there as just another chronic disease. With at this point in time, a terminal end. I just have written another book that will come out in hopefully the late fall with Teresa Webb, who is a woman living with frontotemporal dementia. And one of the things we do in that book is use the literature of a lot of first-person narratives in books written, and almost everybody with a first-person narrative in their memoir has written about how they've contemplated end-of-life choices that they're in control of, realizing that that is taken out of their hands because of their cognitive loss and where that will take them. Everybody wants to talk about it. Everybody wants to have conversations about it. And I think they use their memoirs in that way. And I think it's beautiful, because it does enhance that conversation. And like David and his wife, that conversation, once they had it, they were supported. The hard part is when they're not having these conversations. So I almost cue it up, that I want, and that's what this next book is about. It's for people with early mild cognitive impairment or early dementia to actually facilitate them reflecting, thinking, and having these conversations.
And I appreciate that, Dr. Ann, but I'm wondering, are you the exception and not the rule?
In the medical field?
In the medical practice or field?
I think so. I think there's not that many people who are palliative trained. There's not that many people who are geriatrics, and there's not that many people who have allowed the personal journey of dementia to affect them as much as me. I think I am a weird compilation, but I'm not the only, right. But it is not the norm in medicine. And I think Atul Gawande's Being Mortal addresses that beautifully, kind of like the Barbie movie. The movement is happening, but it's not going to be ready for prime time in a lot of people that are going to be listening to this podcast. So thinking outside the box, as which was a funny metaphor. Thank you for that one. We thank you to you and Lori for bringing this forward so that people can then think outside the box and take some of this away from just the church or just the doctors or just the. This is holistic, as Patty was saying. It's very holistic, and we need to look at it in a holistic way.
Absolutely. And I just want to thank you all for ruining my end of life discussion bingo card. I did not have the Barbie movie on there, so I'm out. Lori, with that, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah. Well, one, I wanted just to say to Anne that, being strange and weird is, you're a unicorn, and unicorns are beautiful, they're magical, and they're changing the world, and they give peace to so many people. So never, ever forget that. You are powerful in terms of what you're doing. I think everybody on this panel is, and the magic comes together when we bring our presence together in community. David, you had a question or a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, I do. Obviously, I'm not a medical professional, but where I feel that my expertise is in the area of language. And when I think about my wife, Cheryl, there is no way that I could use the word suicide to describe what she did, and because that's got so much darn energy around it. So, as this journey continues for all of us, a physician-assisted suicide is something, a terminology that needs to change to really accurately describe, for my experience with VSED and Cheryl. She was completely conscious of what she was doing. There was no stress to it in terms of that decision. And so as I look at the contribution that I can make to this, is that I believe that is we're branding something, we're positioning something in people's minds that is fearful. Physician-assisted suicide versus what Kim was saying, in the language that she was using. So I find that, very, very, very important to throw into this whole conversation on how we look at end-of-life choices and how we language them.
That's a wonderful, wonderful comment. I know in dementia, there's a lot of words that we're trying to shift from getting people to stop saying behavior, instead of looking at it, looking at that reaction as a call for help. There's so many different words. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because terminology can kill a conversation, and it can add fear or it can add comfort. And we need to make this a comfortable conversation so that people can really think through the process of what is best for them. Any other comments? Anybody else want to raise their hand? Kim?
Yeah, I just wanted to close out. Early on, Anne was talking about her kids and how they got tired of her talking about death all the time, and how we had to normalize this more. And I just think that's such an important point to pull out, that I thought it would be a great way to kind of wrap things up, is for everyone to think a little bit about, like, what does it look like if death isn't something that we fear, but it's just a normal part of our lives. And in our household, was thinking Anne's kids and my kids would probably have a good time together, because in my household, it's just what they do. Like, kids don't think of death as a weird thing because we talk about it all the time. And on my daughter's 18th birthday, she came running down the stairs all excited and was like, "Guess what today is, Mom?" And I was like, yeah, it's your 18th birthday. And she's like, "Yeah, but guess what that means?" And I was like, "Right, you're an adult." And she's like, "No, look." And she takes out her advanced directive and she's like, "I finally get to do it." And that was how we celebrated her 18th birthday. So for her, it was a rite of passage. It was the thing she got to do. It was celebratory. It wasn't fearful. And that's not because I'm a great mom. It's because this is what I do for a living. And so that's how my kids were raised. But it does tell you that if you don't treat it as if it's something to be fearful of or afraid of, that it helps the people around you not to view it that way. And that it will also allow us to celebrate life more. Because if you're really in tune with the inevitability of death, then all those little things that bother you no longer become important, because what you're focused on is embracing your life.
Right.
And I just want to follow up on what Kim said, which is beautiful. Thank you. Is that and somebody else brought this up, we get one birth, we get one death, and they're both amazing. They both allow that crap about living to fall away so you can focus on these two amazing times in your life. So I say, like, if once you kind of get past being afraid of it, it opens up this beauty, which is, I think David said it very well when he was talking about the contrast between his wives, and that his second wife has had such a beautiful death. So thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for.
Thank you.
I just want to first say thank you to Lori and to all of our wonderful panelists for taking the time out of your busy schedules and days to, have this important conversation. Before Lori closes us out today, I just want to go to Pastor Ben really quick. We know each other. My family attends the church there. He's a wonderful person, has a beautiful family, and we've had several conversations about something that I'm very passionate about, which a lot of you have touched on, and that's getting resources out to these families, letting them know they're supported. Whether you go to the church or you don't go to the church, we're doing a class Wednesday nights for caregivers at the church now, and we're doing a monthly dementia conference open to anyone and everyone. There's no cost, there's no fees. We're not selling anything other than resources and support for them so that they don't feel like they're alone. What I want to ask Pastor Ben, though, is has he seen the churches get more involved with reaching out to communities with these types of resources, whether it's through, Grief Share, Celebrate Recovery, caregiver support groups, or other events? Do you see churches being more involved with them, or do you see them being less involved? And if it's less involved, do you see a way the churches can get more involved?
Yeah, I think the church's involvement is growing. And a lot of that is just how times have changed, right? Like we know more, we're able to specialize things a little bit more. I think back to when I was in church as a child, and, you have a lot of big groups and maybe a men's Bible study and a ladies' Bible study, but then it just kind of ends there. But then the longer you go, the more you see, there's people that struggle with this, or there's people that struggle with that. My wife and I, unfortunately, went through infertility issues for about 12 years. And there was a lady recently that asked me, because she had gone through it as well. She said, would you guys be open to having a group, for people that are currently gone through it, whatever it might be. And so all of those things, I just think that the options people are seeing the value in having groups like this where you can come and again, someone had mentioned before, until you've, kind of walked in someone's shoes, or until you've been where they are, or, things like that, you really don't understand fully what they're going through. You try, but you can only go so far. So I think more and more churches are open to things like this. And I think it's important, we are really capped by quality leaders, if you will. Someone will come up and make a suggestion. Hey, we should have a group for this. And sure, who's going to run it? Are you going to run it? Yeah, sure, I'll run it. All right, great. As long as you're capable and safe and not going to do anything wonky, you can run the group. And so when Lance, I've been at this position at this church here for a year. So I met Lance, around that time, came and brought these ideas to me. I didn't bat an eye at it. I didn't hesitate at all when he said, I'd like to offer a support group for people in the care ministry or, who are caregivers. My grandmother has done it for years. And again, we think we know what she goes through. We truly don't, and then dementia, my grandmother went through that. Until we were walking through that, we had no idea, what was going on. So it's definitely something that the church is becoming more and more open to or implementing. Again, a lot of times we're just capped by availability of people. I couldn't run these groups personally, but if we have people who are, fit to run them like Lance does, then absolutely let's do it.
Yeah, my thing is, not necessarily just picking on our church. I'm just saying the church community as a whole, I just feel like there's such an important role that they can play to support these families. They go see Dr. Ann, they get a diagnosis of dementia, and now they're dealing with this, and they don't know how to deal with it once they leave those offices from getting that diagnosis. And it just seems like, there's a role and a place for all of us to play, in this journey. I think it's just a machine. Each has an important piece and part to play. And I just want to thank all of you for playing that part and for sharing your expertise with us today. And with that, I'll give it back to Lori.
I'd like to wrap up with one last question to each of you. And if you can just answer it really briefly, but I'm a firm believer in ongoing learning, and everyone here, is an expert in their area. But I would like to ask the question. I'm going to start with Anne. What was the benefit for you of having this conversation today?
The benefit was being able to be in a group of like-minded people and virtually meet this amazing crowd, and to hear that there are other unicorns that want to get this message out.
Great, thank you. Carrie, how about you?
I would agree with what Anne just said. I think that sometimes we think we're lone wolves out here, being the only ones that see the stars, and getting together and talking about it realizes that we may not be together right next door, but that we are out there for each other and that we're great resources.
Great, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I would echo those same comments. It's just it's exciting to see that there's so many people that are so passionate about this topic. And I think a really good takeaway is that comment that people, what they decide today, they can change their mind later. And it's a conversation that needs to continue. It's not a one-time conversation. It's a continuous conversation.
Right. Thank you. Patty?
I think that's absolutely true, that it's a continuous conversation, and that helping people get past the societal stigma of talking about death is a really important part of this whole process. And I think the messaging also has to include that death is a sacred part of life, and that the respect for it needs to be an overarching theme in all of our conversations.
Thank you. And Kim?
I would echo what everybody said, and also just lift up that even that while there may be very different perspectives of how we come about and to this issue, that there really is a lot of consensus around a desire to see people be able to chart their own end and the importance of that. And that's a message that's worth getting out.
Great. David?
Yeah, well, for me, clearly, I just love listening to everybody and the dialogue, having so personally been involved in this. Cheryl's legacy, she wanted it to be to educate people about end-of-life choices. And so, and as I look to my own future now, I say to myself, okay, how can I stay engaged in this conversation? And most importantly, how can I contribute to the conversation? So for me, a desire would be to stay connected to everyone on this panel in every way that I can. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Pastor Ben?
Yeah, I just loved hearing everyone's perspective, the personal stories, coming at this topic, which is very complex from different angles. I think we're all better when we can listen and understand more and not just think what we want to think and shut ourselves in our own offices, but really hear what other people's thoughts and feelings are. I think that's very important.
And Lance, I want to ask you, what did you get out of this conversation?
That there are remarkable people with remarkable resources doing remarkable work to try to better the advancement of this difficult time for so many families.
Wonderful. And I would agree with all of you coming together. I always learn so much. Even if it's in the back of my mind, it pulls it forward again. And to me, this conversation just will help so many, including myself and my own family, have a conversation stepping forward to remove the fear, to see that it's not a one size fits all. And there's many different options and topics that we have to discuss of, what do we want our life to look like? And the end of our life is just important as the beginning and the middle. And we shouldn't push it aside. So thank you. Lance, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Lori. Well, again, thank you everybody today for your time and for taking part in this important discussion. We look forward to continuing the discussion, and we hope that this panel helps families continue or start the conversation for something that all of us need to face and talk about at some point. And Lori, as always, it's great to see you and to see our panel, and we just want to say thank you again to each of you and look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks, Lance and Lori. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today here at Conscious Caregiving with L&L, the show where we're tackling the tough conversations. We look forward to seeing you back next month.